Before the story begins, you must understand one thing about this world. In the land of the Lycan packs, power is everything. The strong claim territory, the bold claim thrones, and the clever, those rare, sharp-minded wolves who know when to speak and when to stay silent, they claim something more lasting than either. They claim survival. The northern packs are ruled by iron law and older still by tradition. Alphas lead, betas serve, and omegas, the lowest rank, the unprotected, the forgotten, they exist in the spaces between. In the corridors, no one watches. In the kitchens, no one dignifies. In the silence that powerful men mistake for agreement. For 10 years, one Omega had survived in exactly that silence. Her name was Aura, and she was about to break every rule she had ever learned. Before we begin, if you love dark Lycan Kings, forbidden mates, and stories that make your heart ache, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe for epic Lycan King romances, where Omegas rise, Kings fall, and love is never gentle. The Invisible Omega. The stone corridors of Thorn Castle smelled of ash, iron, and wet stone. They always smelled this way in the early hours before dawn, when the torches had burned low to orange stubs and the warriors had not yet risen for training, when the great hall lay empty of everything except shadows and the slow settling of ancient walls. It was Aura's favorite time of day. Not because she loved the cold, not because she preferred the darkness, but because in those hours, those quiet, forgotten hours, no one watched her. She moved through the corridors with a bucket and rag, scrubbing the blackened marble floors until they reflected the torchlight like dark mirrors. The work was hard. Her knuckles were perpetually raw. Her knees ached from kneeling on cold stone since she was barely 16 years old. But Aura did not think about the ache. She had learned long ago that invisibility was survival, not the magical kind, the social kind. In Thorn Castle, Omegas were not meant to be seen. They were servants, cleaners, carriers, shadows. They existed to make the castle run smoothly and to disappear the moment a real wolf, an alpha, a beta, a warrior of rank, needed the space. And Aura was the lowest of them all. At 26 winters old, she had no pack name, no family crest, no protection. Her parents had been traveling healers, gentle, wandering souls who believed that knowledge could cross borders, that swords could not. They traded herbs for passage, spoke 5 languages between them, and taught their daughter that the most powerful thing a person could carry was not a weapon. It was understanding. But war did not care for understanding. 10 years ago, during the brutal northern conflict between the rival Alpha territories, her parents had died, tending the wounded on a battlefield that neither side could claim victory over. They had gone to heal. They had not come back. Since then, Aura belonged to no one, and in a world ruled by alphas and warriors, where status was everything and pack affiliation was the only shield a person had, belonging to no one meant belonging to everyone. She scrubbed floors, carried water, cleaned blood from battle armor, listened quietly, watched carefully, and spoke almost never. But Aura carried one secret that no one in Thorn Castle knew, a secret she had inherited from her wandering, peaceful, impossibly optimistic parents, a secret that would soon change everything. She understood the Southern tongue, fluently. The treaty that could end a war. 3 days before the delegation arrived, Thorn Castle changed. It happened the way all great changes in castles do, not with announcement, but with atmosphere. Servants moved faster, guards straightened. Warriors who usually lounged in the training yard now stood in rigid formation, their armor polished to a shine that Aura recognized as the kind that happened only for royalty or for potential enemies. In the servant quarters, the whispers were electric. The Southern delegation. Lord Victor himself. A treaty. A real one this time. Not like the last three. Aura listened and said nothing, but she understood what the others did not. The last three treaties had failed because no one trusted the words crossing between them. The North and South had fought across the contested borderlands for 30 years. The border packs had been decimated, towns burned, wolves displaced, children raised in hiding. The wounds were so deep and so old that even honest words had begun to sound like lies to ears that had heard too many of them. But a treaty, a real one, could change that. If the words were true. The morning the delegation arrived, Thorn Castle became a different creature entirely. Guards lined every corridor. Torches blazed in broad daylight. Banners of black wolves and silver thorns hung from the rafters of the Great Hall, enormous and proud and slightly intimidating in the way that King Dominic intended everything to be. At the center of it all sat the man himself. King Dominic Ashvile. The Alpha King of the Northern Pacts was not what songs made him sound like. The ballads spoke of a towering, roaring war machine, all rage and golden victory. The reality was quieter and somehow more terrifying. He was tall, yes. His frame carried the weight of a man who had fought in real battles, not ceremonial ones. Silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples. Not age, exactly, but the particular exhaustion of carrying too many lives for too long. His eyes were the gray gold of a wolf at dusk, still, patient, and absolutely unreadable. He sat at the head of the council table as if the chair were a throne and the table were a battlefield, which Aura supposed it was. Beside him stood the royal translator, Marcus Hale. Aura had always disliked Marcus Hale without being able to explain why. He was polished in the way that certain people become polished, not through honesty or effort, but through performance. His posture was perfect, his accent impeccable. His smile was the kind that arrived a half-second too late, as if it had calculated whether smiling was advantageous before allowing itself to appear. He bowed to the Southern delegation as they entered. And that was when Aura, kneeling beside a far wall with her bucket and rag, made the mistake of paying attention. Lord Victor of the Southern Pacts was older than she expected, a lean man with a sun-darkened face and the careful eyes of someone who had negotiated in rooms where losing meant more than embarrassment. He bowed to Dominic. He took his seat. And then he began to speak. The Southern tongue rolled through the great hall like distant thunder, low, rhythmic, full of the rounded consonants and long vowels that Aura's mother had taught her as a child by firelight, turning language into music. Marcus translated smoothly, professionally, confidently, and Aura froze. Her rag slipped from her hand. 'Cause Marcus was lying. Not slightly, not accidentally, not the way exhausted translators sometimes blur meaning at the edges. Deliberately. Lord Victor was speaking of hesitation, of concerns about the contested borderlands that still had not been resolved. He spoke of missing wolves, of 3 scouting parties that had vanished in the past season without explanation. He spoke with the measured caution of a man who wanted peace, but who had been burned before and needed to understand why the burning had happened before he put his hand back near the flame. But Marcus told King Dominic something entirely different. The Southern Alpha agrees fully and without reservation to all current treaty terms. Aura's blood ran cold. That was not what Victor had said. Not even close. If this treaty was signed under false translation, if Dominic believed Victor had agreed to conditions Victor had never approved, both sides would eventually discover the gap between what was promised and what was intended. And in the world of the northern packs, where broken oaths were answered with blood, that gap had only one possible end: another war, thousands dead. Border towns burned again. The same wolves, the same ground, the same endless, grinding devastation. And all because one man had lied in a treaty hall. The moment that changed everything: stay quiet. Stay invisible. Those were the two rules Ara had lived by for 10 years. They were not elegant rules. They were not noble rules. But they were the rules that had kept her fed, housed, and alive in a castle where none of those things were guaranteed for an Omega without protection. She picked her rag back up. She kept her eyes on the floor. She told herself it was not her concern. And then Marcus translated the next sentence. Victor had asked about the status of the Redfen pack, the border wolves who had suffered most during the last conflict, whose territory had been cut in half by the old treaty lines. He asked with genuine concern, with the careful phrasing of a man who had made promises to those wolves and needed to know they would be honored. Marcus told Dominic that Victor had no interest in the border territory, that the southern packs considered the Redfen region settled matter. Ara's jaw tightened. The lies kept coming. Every concern became approval. Every warning became agreement. Every cautious, measured question from a man trying to build peace became, in Marcus's smooth and confident rendering, the enthusiastic capitulation of a weaker party eager to please. Victor did not know. He could not know. He spoke his language and heard Marcus's voice rise and fall with convincing authority, and had no reason to suspect that every word was being inverted. He trusted the translator. They all did. Ara's hands trembled. No Omega interrupted royal proceedings. That rule was older than any of them. No servant spoke during alpha negotiations. To do so was not merely improper. It was an act that could be interpreted as aggression, as insanity, as a deliberate attempt to sabotage peace. The punishment for such an act could be imprisonment, exile, or worse. She thought of her parents, traveling healers, gentle souls, gone. They had believed in words. They had believed that the right word, spoken in the right moment, could change the entire shape of a thing. The hall filled with the smooth, convincing cadence of Marcus's voice. Ara looked at Victor's face. She saw it there. The flicker. The slight frown of a man who thought he recognized a mistranslation, but could not prove it. The way his eyes cut briefly to Marcus. The way his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the edge of the table. He suspected. But he had no proof. He had no ally in this room. Ara thought of the Redfen wolves, of border towns, of children raised in hiding. The rag hit the floor, and the words came out before fear could stop them. "Your Majesty!" The hall froze, not gradually, not politely, instantly, completely, as if the air itself had been pulled from the room. Every warrior turned, every counselor stared. Marcus went the precise color of old ash. King Dominic did not turn quickly. He turned the way a glacier moves, inevitably, heavily, with the kind of certainty that suggested the turning was entirely on his schedule. His gray-gold eyes found her across the length of the great hall. She was kneeling on the floor, a girl with a bucket, an Omega with a rag in her hand, and her heart slamming against her ribs hard enough that she was certain the entire room could hear it. Dominic's voice, when it came, was quiet. Quiet in the way that a sheathed blade is quiet. "Explain." Ara stood slowly. Her legs were not entirely steady. She clasped her hands together to stop them from shaking visibly, and lifted her chin the way her mother had always told her to, not to show defiance, but to show she was still breathing. "He says Lord Victor agrees," she said. Her voice was thin at the edges. She forced it wider. But that is not what Lord Victor said. A murmur ran through the hall like a current through dark water. Dominic's expression did not change. And what did he say, Omega? Ara closed her eyes for precisely one breath. Then she opened them and looked at Victor, and she repeated his exact words back, in perfect Southern tongue. She repeated the concerns about the border scouts, the question about the Red Fen Pack, the hesitation about the unresolved territorial lines, the careful, measured caution of a man who wanted peace, but who needed honesty first. She heard her mother's voice in every syllable. The hall was absolutely silent. Lord Victor's eyes had gone very still. Then, slowly, his expression changed. Something cracked open in it that looked almost like relief. He laughed. Once, deep and surprised and entirely genuine. She speaks truth. All eyes turned to Marcus. The translator's confidence did not shatter all at once. It went the way expensive things break under pressure. First a crack, then a pause, then the full collapse. Sweat beaded at his temple. His perfect posture developed a flaw. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. King Dominic rose from his chair. It was a slow movement, unhurried. The movement of a man who had no need to rush because the outcome was already decided. The air itself grew heavier. Guards! 2 warriors moved from their posts with the decisive speed of men who had been waiting for exactly this kind of order. Dominic's voice, when it came again, was barely above a whisper. That made it worse. Take him to the dungeon. The hall erupted in murmurs that crashed against the stone walls like waves. Every head turned. Every eye moved. Alliances were being rapidly recalculated. Ara could feel it. The way the room's energy shifted as people tried to understand what had just happened and what it meant for them. And then King Dominic looked back at her. The invisible Omega. The girl with the bucket. The woman who had just walked into the most dangerous room in the northern packs and told the most powerful man in it that he was being lied to. His expression was unreadable, but he was looking at her. Really looking. The unexpected promotion. Hours passed. Ara spent them in a small antechamber off the great hall, sitting on a wooden bench with her hands folded in her lap, and her mind cycling through every possible outcome of what she had done. The outcomes ranged from bad to catastrophic. Dismissal was the most optimistic. Exile from castle grounds felt more realistic. Imprisonment, the dungeon Marcus was presumably already occupying, was a live possibility. Ara had interrupted royal proceedings. She had directly contradicted the king's chosen translator in front of a foreign delegation. She had done it without permission, without rank, without any standing that any court in any pack would recognize. She had done it because it was right. She was increasingly aware that rightness had never once protected anyone in Thorn Castle. The door opened. A guard, taller than any man had a reasonable right to be, stood in the frame. The king will see you. The throne room of Thorn Castle was not what visitors expected. There was no gold, no spectacle, no rows of treasures designed to impress foreign dignitaries into submission. There was stone. Old stone, dark with age, and worn smooth by centuries. There were weapons on the walls, real weapons, not ceremonial ones. There was a single enormous fireplace burning so hot that the air near it shimmered. And there was Dominic. Alone. He was standing when she entered, not seated. He had discarded the formal outer coat of the council meeting and stood now in the simpler dress of a working king. Dark wool, unadorned. He looked simultaneously more approachable and more dangerous. He studied her the way he had in the Great Hall, like a puzzle, like a problem, like something entirely outside his existing categories. You speak Southern fluently, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Your Majesty. How long have you been in this castle? 10 years, Your Majesty. Something moved across his face at that, brief and complicated. 10 years. And in 10 years, no one here knew you spoke Southern. No one asked, Your Majesty? The fire popped in the silence. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Aura kept her eyes at a respectful angle, not quite meeting his, not quite avoiding them. The Omega position, the survival position, the position she had learned before she learned anything else about this castle. Who taught you? He asked. My parents, she said softly. They were traveling healers. They traded herbs and medicines across pack territories. They believed, she paused. They believed that language was the only border that mattered. Another silence, longer this time. Then Dominic did something that she had not considered among any of her anticipated outcomes. He said, From this day forward, you will serve as royal translator of Thorn Castle. Aura blinked. She was fairly certain she had misheard. But the court had not misheard. The handful of advisors positioned near the walls of the throne room had clearly, unmistakably not misheard, because the silence that followed was the particular silence of people who have just received an enormous shock and have not yet agreed on how to react to it. An Omega, a royal position. Unheard of. Your Majesty, one of the advisors began. Dominic looked at him, just looked. The advisor stopped speaking. Dominic's word was law. Every person in that room understood this. It had been law since the day he took the throne, and he had never once given anyone reason to think the law might have exceptions. He looked back at Aura. Do you accept? Aura thought of the bucket she had left in the corridor, of the cold marble floor she had been scrubbing since she was 16, of the 10 years of silence. Yes, Your Majesty, she said. And the course of her life pivoted on that single syllable. 6 months of quiet power. The seasons turned. Winter softened into a tentative, grudging spring. The training yard filled with mud and the smell of rain. The great hall, usually all stone and cold light, became something almost warm as preparations began for the next round of treaty negotiations. And Aura became, almost without anyone noticing it happen, indispensable. The transition was not smooth. There were advisors who found reasons to be absent when she entered rooms, warriors who refused to meet her eyes, court officials who addressed their questions to the wall rather than to her, as if the universe might cooperate by answering them without requiring them to speak directly to an Omega. Aura paid them no particular attention. She had work to do. The first real test came 3 weeks after her appointment, when a trade delegation arrived from the eastern coastal packs. Their lead negotiator spoke a dialect that the previous translator's notes identified as Standard Northern, which it emphatically was not. It was a coastal variant with entirely different word order rules and a set of formal honorifics that, if mistranslated, would have suggested the northern packs considered the eastern coastal wolves subordinate rather than allied. Aura caught it before the first meeting began. She prepared a briefing note for Dominic. Specific, precise, with examples. He read it the night before. At the meeting, he adjusted his approach accordingly. The eastern delegation left satisfied. A trade route that had been stalled for 2 years opened within the month. No one congratulated Aura, but Dominic noticed. The second test was harder. A diplomat from the Westlands arrived with a proposal that was, in the language of the Westland Formal Register, technically generous, but which contained 3 phrases that functioned in their legal tradition as conditional waivers. Signing the treaty as written would have ceded the Northern Pac's right to appeal border disputes for the next 50 years. Aura flagged all 3 phrases in a written note. She included the legal context, She suggested revised language. The diplomat, who had clearly expected to slide the waivers through unnoticed, left the negotiation looking considerably less satisfied than he had arrived. Word spread through diplomatic channels, quietly, the way important things always spread. Thorn Castle's new translator was not someone you tried to deceive. Something else was changing too. King Dominic had begun requesting her presence for more than negotiations. It began with questions, casual, specific questions about pack customs she had encountered in her translations. How did the Southern packs traditionally mark the end of a conflict? What was the Eastern coastal word for reconciliation? And what did it suggest about their concept of the thing itself? Ara answered honestly, thoroughly. She did not deflect or perform modesty she did not feel. She had spent 10 years listening and reading and thinking in a castle that had never once asked her to speak. She had things to say. Dominic listened, really listened. Not the half attention of a powerful man tolerating a subordinate's report. Full attention, the kind that made her feel uncomfortably and wonderfully seen. He asked her opinion on strategy, on diplomacy, on the patterns she had noticed in how different packs framed the same territorial disputes as if they were talking about entirely different things. She gave it, carefully at first, then more freely. The court whispered. Of course it did. Courts always whispered about things they could not understand. An Omega in the council chamber. An Omega whose opinion the king sought. An Omega who had walked into the great hall with a bucket and come out with a title. Dominic ignored the whispers, because he had found, in the person of Ara, something he had not known he was looking for. Someone who told him the truth, without calculation, without agenda, without the particular kind of careful, strategic honesty that was really just a more sophisticated form of manipulation. Just truth. He had not known how rare it was until he tasted it. The confession. Late autumn, the kind of evening where the cold had teeth. A long council meeting had stretched past the third evening bell, arguing about provisioning for the winter border patrols. The advisors had eventually filtered out, leaving the castle library nearly empty except for the firelight and the particular quiet that fell over large rooms when the people who had been filling them suddenly left. Ara had stayed to finish compiling the meeting notes. It was the kind of work that required the building to be quiet, cross-referencing what had been said against what had been agreed, flagging the places where those two things diverged. They diverged more often than anyone liked to acknowledge. She heard Dominic before she saw him, the particular sound of his footsteps, which she had learned over 6 months to distinguish from every other footstep in the castle. Heavy but controlled, purposeful in a way that was distinct from urgency. He stopped near the window. For a moment he just stood there, looking out at the dark beyond the glass. Ara. She set down her pen. Your Majesty. I need to tell you something. His voice was quieter than usual, not the tactical quiet of a man choosing his words for effect, just quiet. Ara waited. The fire settled. He turned from the window. I have fought wars, he said, negotiated peace, led armies across ground so frozen the swords stuck in their scabbards, faced challenges to my authority from wolves 3 times my size. A pause. None of those things frightened me. Ara felt something shift in the room, the quality of the air, the weight of the silence. He stepped closer. Until you. Her breath caught, not metaphorically, literally. She felt it happen, the small physical betrayal of a body reacting to something before the mind had worked out how to respond to it. Why? She asked. It was barely a word. Because you matter to me. He said it simply, without the ornate framing that powerful men usually draped around vulnerability, as if the words needed armor. and things that matter to me are things that can be lost. And losing, he paused again. Losing frightens me in a way that fighting never has. Ara looked at him. This king, this man, this person who had given a bucket-carrying Omega a throne room title on the basis of a single act of truth, who had listened to her opinions in council chambers and changed actual policy on the basis of things she had said, who had spent 6 months slowly becoming someone she recognized as, deeply and irrevocably, and rather inconveniently, her friend. And possibly more than that. Dominic continued. His voice was steady, but she could hear the effort. You are the most honest person in this castle. You are the most intelligent person in most rooms you enter. You are brave in a way that has nothing to do with size or strength or rank. His jaw tightened slightly. The court says that an Omega cannot be queen. His eyes darkened. I disagree. The world seemed to stop. Outside, somewhere, a wolf howled in the dark beyond the castle walls. A long, distant sound that Ara had heard 1,000 times from 1,000 corridors, and that had never before felt like an answer. Will you allow me to court you? Ara's voice, when it came, was not entirely steady, but it was sure. Yes. The Omega who became queen. The seasons changed 3 more times. Spring to summer. Summer to autumn. Autumn to a winter that came early and hard and dusted every turret of Thorn Castle in white. And then, spring again. 1 year after Ara had asked Dominic to court her, or rather, 1 year after she had said yes to his asking. Thorn Castle had never seen a wedding quite like it. There was no shortage of opinion about the wedding. The court had spent an entire year generating opinion, in fact, at a volume and persistence that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so exhausting. Certain advisors had submitted formal written objections, several of them on increasingly decorated stationery. 2 pack leaders from the far north had made it pointedly known that they considered the match unorthodox. Dominic had read every objection. He had filed them carefully, and proceeded without modification. The ceremony was held in the castle courtyard under the gray-blue sky of early morning, when the light was still thin and the world felt newly made. Warriors filled every corner. Pack leaders had gathered from across the north, some curious, some skeptical, some who had come specifically to see whether Dominic's rumored new queen was real or whether the court gossip had, as it sometimes did, taken a minor fact and turned it into a legend. They saw real. Ara had refused elaborate court dress, not out of false modesty. She had made her peace with visibility over the past year, but because she was not interested in disguising herself in borrowed splendor on the most important morning of her life. She wore deep gray, embroidered at the collar, with the silver thorn pattern that had become, in quiet ways, associated with her work. Her hair was up, her hands were steady. She walked into the courtyard alone, as she had walked into everything for 10 years. But this time, the crowd parted for her. And at the altar, Dominic was waiting. The ceremony was simple. Both of them had wanted that. The vows were plain, the old pack words, the ones that had been used for 1,000 years of joining, stripped of the ceremonial additions that had accumulated over centuries and had begun to mean nothing. When the vows were done, Dominic turned to the assembled packs. His voice carried easily across the courtyard. It always had. This woman saved this kingdom with truth. She will rule beside me as my equal. I claim her as my queen. The sound that came back at them was not the polished, ceremonial applause of a court performing its approval. It was the sound of warriors who had fought alongside this man for years, who trusted his judgments in ways that mattered, who had watched an Omega walk into a diplomatic crisis with nothing but truth and change the outcome. And who were, Ara realized, roaring, not performing it. Actually, roaring. History moved in that moment, not with cannon fire and proclamation, but with the sound of a crowd that had decided, without being told to, that it was witnessing something worth witnessing. No regrets. Months later. Winter again, but gentler this time. The snow fell soft and even over Thorn Valley, laying a silence over the landscape that muffled everything. The training yard, the outer courtyard, the distant sound of the river that never fully froze. Ara stood on the balcony off her chambers. Her chambers. The phrase still occasionally surprised her. She wore a thick wool coat that Dominic had made for her after noting, with the particular concern of a man who had begun thinking of someone else's comfort as his default concern, that she never seemed to dress warmly enough. She watched the snow fall. She thought about the morning she had interrupted the treaty. She remembered the exact feeling of it, the cold floor under her knees, the rag slipping from her hand, the roar of blood in her ears that she had thought might be the last thing she heard before something much worse began. The moment when staying silent had become physically impossible, when the words had simply come out, because not saying them had stopped being an option. She had been so afraid. And she had spoken anyway. That single moment, that one crack in 10 years of practiced invisibility, had reshaped every moment that came after it. The translator's role, the council chambers, the evenings by the fire debating pack law with a king who actually wanted to be argued with, the year of courtship that had been simultaneously the strangest and most honest period of her life, the morning in the courtyard when a crowd of warriors had roared and history had moved. All of it, from one rag hitting one floor. She heard him before she saw him. Those footsteps, familiar now as her own heartbeat. Dominic stepped out onto the balcony and stood beside her. He looked at the valley below, at the snow, at the trees on the far ridge standing dark against the white sky. After a moment, he put his arm around her shoulders. "Any regrets?" he asked. Quietly. Not anxiously. He had long since stopped needing her reassurance in the anxious way. But there was something genuine in it. Something that recognized that the path they had walked had cost her things alongside the things it had given her. Ara leaned into him slightly. She thought about the bucket, the cold floor, the silence. "None," she said. He nodded once. She smiled. But fate, as it turns out, wasn't done with them yet. It rarely is. The hidden enemy. 2 years after the wedding. Thorn Castle in early morning. The same low light and cold corridors where the story had begun. Different now, in small ways that mattered. The servants moved with a different kind of ease. The guards no longer stood with the particular tension of people waiting for something to go wrong. Ara was in her study when the letter arrived. There was nothing unusual about its delivery. A courier. Standard transit markings. The castle seal on the outer wrapping, indicating it had come through normal diplomatic channels. But the wax seal on the letter itself was black. Not the dark red of official correspondence, not the blue-black of trade dispatches. Black. The way she had only ever seen one seal before. She broke it. Inside was no greeting, no formal address, no diplomatic preamble. Just a single sentence, written in a hand she did not recognize. A hand that was careful in the way that people are careful when they want their handwriting to be unidentifiable. Marcus Hale was only the first. Ara read it twice. Then she set it down with great care, the way you set down something that might shatter or might burn, or might simply be a mistake in your own perception that a second glance would correct. It was not a mistake. The implications arrived in order, each one more significant than the last. Marcus Hale had been in that room for a reason. Someone had placed him there. Someone had recruited a royal translator, a man in one of the most sensitive positions in the northern pacts, and had directed him to poison the treaty. Not to prevent peace permanently, perhaps. Peace was difficult to prevent indefinitely. But to delay it, to corrupt it, to ensure that when it finally came, it would come on terms that someone else had shaped. And that someone had sent this letter, which meant one of two things. Either they wanted Aura to know, which suggested either warning, threat, or recruitment. Or they had made a mistake, and people who operated at this level of patience and sophistication rarely made mistakes. Aura looked at the handwriting again, and felt the cold move through her differently from how cold usually moved, because she recognized it, not clearly, not with certainty. The way you recognize something you have seen in peripheral vision, at a strange angle, in insufficient light. The recognizing is there, but the proof is not. But it nagged. It nagged the way things nag when something important is very close and you are not yet quite ready to name it. Dominic found her still in the study an hour later. He read the letter without expression. Twice. Then he set it down and was quiet for a moment. Outside the study window, Thorn Valley stretched toward a horizon that was, just at that moment, the dark gray of an approaching weather front. "Someone else is manipulating the packs," he said. Yes. Someone who has been doing this for a long time, long enough to have placed Marcus, long enough to have known the timing of the southern delegation. Long enough, Aura said carefully, to be inside the castle. The silence that followed was a different quality from previous silences. Heavier. Colder. The kind that comes when a door you thought was closed turns out to have been open all along, onto something very dark. She picked up the letter again, looked at the handwriting, let the not-quite recognition work at her, the way she had learned to let things work when forcing them only pushed them further away. "I know this hand," she said. "I almost know it. I need—" She stopped, because it had come. Not clearly. Not with the sharp arrival of obvious recognition, but with the slow, certain, stomach-dropping feeling of a thing that had been true all along and had simply been waiting for the right angle of light. She had seen this handwriting in the castle records, in the approved correspondence files, in the documents that only certain people had clearance to produce.
Someone trusted.
Someone with access. Someone who had sat in rooms she had sat in. Who had heard things she had said. She looked up at Dominic. His expression was very still. He had been watching her think. Waiting. "Then we find them," she said. It was not a question. Dominic smiled, slightly. The particular smile of a man who had been hoping she would say exactly that, and had known she would. Together. Tilde, tilde, tilde. And somewhere in the corridors of Thorn Castle, those stone corridors that smelled of ash and iron and wet stone, that had heard 1,000 years of secrets, another pair of eyes watched the light in the study window. Waited. Planned. Calculated. For the next move in a game that had been playing out for longer than either Dominic or Aura yet understood. A game in which they were not the only pieces, not even, perhaps, the most important ones. The snow kept falling over Thorn Valley. The fire in the study kept burning. And the story, as the best stories do, was only just beginning. End.